Welcome to Momentum Mind, the place where your mind learns to take control of every room you walk into and every decision you make. Today, we're diving deep into a retelling of the mind-shaping strategies from the book Pitch Anything by Oren Klaff. Stay with me, because by the end of this audio, you'll see the hidden forces of attention, desire, and influence like never before. Chapter 1: The Room Where Decisions Bend. The building looked ordinary from the outside. Gray stone, wide windows, quiet halls that smelled faintly of polish and old paper. But inside, behind a door that never stayed open for long, the air felt different. He could sense it before he even stepped in. The pressure. The unspoken judgment. The invisible weighing of worth. He stood alone in the hallway, holding a thin folder that felt far heavier than it should have. His palms were warm. His thoughts ran ahead of him, rehearsing arguments, polishing phrases, imagining approval. He believed that if he explained clearly enough, logically enough, the people inside would see the truth. They would understand. They would say yes. That belief was the first mistake. The door opened, and a voice called his name. Calm. Neutral. Almost bored. He entered the room. The space was wide and bright, with a long table that reflected the light like still water. On the far side sat a small group of people, relaxed in their chairs, arms open, expressions unreadable. They did not rise. They did not smile. They waited. He began speaking immediately. Words poured out of him in careful order. He explained what he had built, why it mattered, how much effort it took. He pointed to charts, to projections, to future success. He tried to sound confident, but his voice kept rising slightly at the end of each sentence, as if asking permission. No one interrupted. That silence felt encouraging, so he continued. He spoke faster. He added details. He answered questions that had not been asked yet. He wanted them to feel safe. He wanted them to feel informed. Across the table, one of them leaned back, another checked something on a small glowing screen. A third nodded, not in agreement, but in rhythm with their own thoughts. He did not notice the shift until it was too late. The room had decided. By the time he reached what he believed was his strongest point, the energy had already drained away. The faces in front of him were polite now. Distant. The kind of politeness that closes doors softly. They thanked him for coming. They said they would be in touch. He left the room lighter than when he entered, as if something essential had been quietly removed. Outside, the world looked the same, but he felt altered. Confused. Angry. He had done everything right. He had explained himself clearly. He had been honest. He had worked hard. So why had it failed? That question followed him for a long time. It followed him into other rooms, other meetings, other carefully prepared conversations that ended the same way. Always polite. Always reasonable. Always empty, until one night, sitting alone under dim light with nothing but frustration for company, he finally understood something that changed everything. The room was not logical. The room was not fair. The room was not listening the way he thought it was. Beneath the polished surface of calm discussion lived something older and sharper. A part of the mind that did not care about effort or explanations. A part that judged instantly, emotionally, and without mercy. A part that decided before words even formed. He began to see it everywhere. In the way attention snapped towards certain people the moment they spoke. In how confidence bent conversations without effort. In how some ideas landed with weight while others dissolved in midair. It was not about being right. It was about control. There existed, hidden beneath everyday language, a silent game played in every important room. A game of frames. Invisible structures of meaning that decided who led and who followed, who persuaded and who pleaded. Most people never knew the game was happening. They walked into rooms offering logic to a mind that did not want logic. They spoke to reason when instinct was in charge. They tried to convince when the real battle had already been lost. He stopped doing that. Instead, he began watching. He watched how powerful speakers entered rooms slowly, as if the space belonged to them. How they spoke less, not more. How they allowed silence to stretch until others leaned in. How they never chased approval, and somehow received it. He noticed something else too. They did not explain, they revealed. They did not ask to be chosen. They behaved as if choosing them was the obvious outcome. This was not arrogance. It was something colder. More precise. A way of arranging reality so that agreement felt natural, almost inevitable. He learned that every room has a center of gravity. Whoever controls that center controls the outcome. And that center is never logic. It is emotion, status, and tension. Once he understood that, the world changed. Rooms that once felt heavy became playable. Conversations that once drained him became charged with possibility. He stopped trying to prove value and started creating it in the minds of others. When he entered rooms now, he did not rush to speak. He let the air adjust to him. He allowed curiosity to form. He framed the conversation before anyone else could, and something remarkable happened. People leaned forward, they asked questions, they fought for his attention. The same ideas that once failed now landed with force. Not because the ideas had changed, but because the way they were presented obeyed the hidden rules of the mind. The ancient part of the brain had been satisfied. It felt safety. It felt clarity. It felt a sense of order. It felt led. One evening, after another meeting ended with quiet nods and eager follow-ups, he stood alone again in a hallway. But this time, the feeling was different. He was calm. Grounded. In control. He knew something most people in the world did not, that every pitch is a small battle for dominance. That every conversation creates a frame, and someone will own it. That the moment you start explaining, you may already be losing. And as he stepped outside, he realized the most dangerous truth of all: once you see the game, you cannot unsee it. And now, every room would test him. Chapter 2, The Mind's Hidden Theater. The next morning, he walked through streets that looked ordinary, but he no longer saw them that way. Every storefront, every cafe, every crowded corner seemed like a stage. He could feel the subtle performances people put on, the invisible contests for attention, influence, and dominance. The world had revealed itself as a theater, and every conversation was a scene in which power whispered behind the lines. He returned to his office, a narrow space with high ceilings, the walls lined with books that smelled faintly of leather and dust. Here, he began experimenting. He could not yet enter the next room and bend it to his will, but he could practice. He spoke to his reflection, imagining an unseen audience. He rehearsed gestures, pauses, and phrases, not for content, but for effect. He realized that meaning alone was weak. Meaning must be delivered in a form the mind could accept. Late that afternoon, a message arrived. The sender's name was familiar, someone who controlled access to a world he wanted desperately to enter. A room where decisions were whispered into existence, where the currency was attention and status, not logic or hard work. The message requested a meeting. He felt a rush of anticipation but resisted the urge to prepare in his usual way. Charts, notes, bullet points, all of that would be useless here. Instead, he focused on controlling his frame. He envisioned the invisible forces at play, the hunger of attention, the pull of intrigue, the silent questions of dominance. The meeting room was not like the last one. It was smaller, darker, a place where the walls themselves seemed to lean in. A single table sat in the center, polished black like obsidian, reflecting light from a single lamp. Two people waited. One leaned forward, sharp eyes fixed on him. The other reclined, casual, almost indifferent, yet somehow commanding. He felt the tension settle immediately. This was a room that tested everything. Not his ideas, but his ability to hold the frame. To survive the invisible judgments and the silent pressures. He started speaking cautiously, almost out of instinct. But then he remembered, this was not about caution. It was about presence. Control. He allowed his voice to lower, slower, firmer. He let the silence between sentences stretch. He let the pause speak for him. One of the figures raised a hand, as if to challenge him, and a small smile curved the other's lips. But he did not falter. He had learned that the instant someone tries to unsettle you, that is when the frame must be strongest. He did not explain. He did not argue. He revealed, in small hints, the value of his idea and, more importantly, his own command over it. The room responded in ways he could not see, but he felt. Subtle shifts in posture, flickers in the eyes, brief inclinations of the head, these were the signals of the hidden mind, the ancient part that decides first and asks questions later. He noticed something else. The leaning back figure occasionally glanced at a small device on the table. It seemed to record, or monitor, or judge. And every time it did, the energy in the room thickened. He realized that influence could not only be direct but mediated. Observers, tools, even silence could bend the balance if handled correctly. Hours passed in minutes. By the end, one of the figures finally spoke, asking a single question, not a clarification, not a challenge, but a question designed to test whether he could handle a sudden shift. His response was measured. He revealed a glimpse of confidence, enough to satisfy the unspoken hunger of the room, but not so much that it seemed rehearsed. When the meeting concluded, the leaning back figure finally stood. Interesting, they said, voice flat but tinged with something like approval. We'll see where this goes. He walked out into the night, heart pounding, senses alive. The streetlights reflected on wet pavement, and every shadow seemed to move with intent. He understood now that each encounter, each pitch, each conversation was a battle for the unseen center of gravity. Winning depended not on facts or logic, but on controlling the stage before the stage could control you. Back in his small apartment, he replayed every second of the meeting. He analyzed every glance, every pause, every flicker of attention. He knew he had survived, but survival was not enough. The game demanded mastery, not luck, and then a thought struck him. If he could see the invisible forces, understand the ancient mind's hunger for status and certainty, and bend rooms to his will, what else could he influence? What doors, he wondered, lay closed to others but open to those who had learned the rules? The realization was thrilling and terrifying. There were rooms that no one could enter unprepared. Rooms where failure was immediate, public, and unforgettable. Rooms where one misstep could erase months of work and reputation in an instant. He knew he had glimpsed the edge of one of those rooms. And now, he had to step closer. A soft knock at the door startled him. It was a message, not in handwriting, but projected as a faint glow on the wall. Just a single line, "Are you ready to play on a larger stage?" The glow pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, and he understood, the game was about to change. And this time, the stakes were far higher. Chapter 3, The Hall of Mirrors. He followed the faint glow through the twisting streets, the city around him shifting subtly as he moved. The lamps seemed dimmer, the shadows sharper, and the air carried a faint hum, almost imperceptible, as if the city itself was aware he was being tested. He felt anticipation, but not fear. Fear would betray him here. He kept his shoulders straight, his head high, imagining the invisible currents of attention bending around him like wind through tall trees. The glow led him to a building unlike any he had seen before. Its facade shimmered, reflective and smooth, as if liquid glass had been poured over stone. The entrance was wide and arched, but the doors were silent, moving without hinges, opening only when he stepped close enough to acknowledge them. Beyond, a long corridor stretched ahead, lined with countless mirrors that reflected not just his image, but the faint flickers of light that seemed to pulse from somewhere deeper. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. Every step echoed softly, yet the mirrors multiplied the sound, creating an almost imperceptible rhythm. He noticed that each reflection did not exactly match him. Sometimes his eyes lingered too long, sometimes his posture was slightly altered, as if the mirrors were testing him, probing for weakness, for distraction. At the end of the corridor, the space opened into a vast hall. It was grand, but not in the traditional sense. The ceiling arched high, disappearing into darkness, and the walls were covered with reflective surfaces that caught light from no visible source. The floor was polished stone, cool under his shoes, stretching endlessly. In the center, a circle of figures waited. They were dressed simply, but their presence was magnetic. Each person radiated calm, power, and subtle menace. They did not speak, but the air vibrated with unspoken authority. He understood immediately, this hall demanded more than ideas. It demanded mastery. One of them stepped forward, tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the layers of thought he carried. "You have been learning," they said, voice soft but weighted, "but have you truly seen?" He did not answer. He simply stood, feeling the space, letting the energy of the room flow over him. He realized that speaking too soon here would be fatal. The room needed to understand that he understood it, not the other way around. The figure raised a hand, and the mirrors shifted. Not physically, but perceptibly, like the reflections themselves began to bend, to rearrange, creating illusions of more figures, more movement. The hall was alive, and he sensed instantly, every perception here could be questioned. Every assumption could be challenged. He walked forward, slowly, each step deliberate, each breath measured. He felt the subtle pull of attention, the silent tests of dominance. The figures did not attack, they did not challenge overtly. Instead, they allowed tension to build, letting him confront his own instincts. The mirrors multiplied his doubts, his fears, his usual desire to explain, to justify. But he resisted. He did not speak. He let the room unfold around him. A sudden motion, one of the figures extended a hand, not toward him, but toward the reflections. The mirrors rippled, and he saw versions of himself moving independently, hesitant, apologetic, eager to please. His chest tightened. The hall whispered, "Do you control your mind, or does your mind control you?" He clenched his fists but kept his posture calm. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his chin. He forced his mind to settle, to focus only on the present. He realized then that influence here was not a battle of words, but a battle of inner frames. One could be strong outside only if the mind was immovable inside. Time passed, or perhaps it did not. Minutes stretched like hours. The figures studied him, testing the rhythm of his breathing, the clarity of his attention. Every instinct he had relied on in the past, pleading for approval, over-explaining, predicting responses, was useless here. Then, a voice, deep and almost melodic, filled the hall. Your frame is strong, but incomplete. You know control. You have not yet created desire. He frowned. Desire. Not persuasion. Not explanation. Desire. He realized the hall was teaching him something subtle. People cannot be convinced. They can only be drawn. They must feel the pull, the gravity, the inevitability of following. He understood instinctively. He began to move differently. Not rushing forward, not trying to dominate, but creating presence. Small gestures, confident but restrained. A hint of mystery in his eyes. A smile that suggested understanding, not agreement. The hall responded. The mirror softened, the reflections becoming less threatening, more like observers than judges. The figures leaned slightly forward. Attention gathered toward him naturally, like iron to a magnet. The sudden sharp knock echoed through the hall, though there was no door in sight. A ripple of tension spread, and all movement froze. The tallest figure spoke again. Tomorrow, you will step into the arena. But tonight, remember, control is not enough. You must awaken the desire to follow, or all else will crumble. He nodded silently, understanding the gravity of what was coming. The hall seemed to pulse, almost alive, as if aware that the next test would not be in mirrors or reflections, but in the unpredictable chaos of others' minds. He left the hall of mirrors slowly, feeling the weight of its lesson. The city outside appeared ordinary again, yet he knew the lesson would never leave him. Desire. Attention. Control. Not separate, but intertwined, a triangle he had only just begun to understand. And in the shadows behind a street lamp, a figure watched him, silent, unmoving, as though noting whether he would pass the next trial or be broken by it. If you want, I can move on to chapter 4, where he faces his first true real-world test of this mastery, a high-stakes pitch in a place that seems almost enchanted, where the rules of ordinary logic no longer apply. Do you want me to continue with that next? Chapter 4, The Arena of Eyes. The morning air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and smoke from unseen fires. The city around him seemed ordinary, but he already knew it wasn't. Every corner, every alley, every passerby could be part of the unseen game. Today, the stakes were real. Today, the lesson of the Hall of Mirrors would be tested in the flesh, not reflection. The building he entered was immense, its glass facade reflecting the sky in jagged shards. Inside, the lobby was silent, polished, perfect. But he felt the tension in the air immediately, hundreds of eyes, waiting, evaluating, measuring. The room was filled with people who did not simply listen, they consumed. Their attention was sharp, their instincts fast. Some smiled politely, others barely glanced in his direction. Yet he sensed them all, like prey or predators in a single instant. At the far end, a raised platform held a long table. Behind it, 5 figures sat, each radiating presence, each exuding authority. He had seen similar setups before, but never with this level of intensity. The weight of the room pressed down, not physically, but psychologically. Every instinct he had once relied on whispered panic, explain more, convince harder, prove yourself, but he had learned better. He did not rush. He allowed the silence to stretch as he walked forward. Each step deliberate, each movement controlled. The hall seemed to bend around him, attention aligning, drawing toward the center of the stage. The first challenge came instantly. One of the figures spoke without raising their head. Why should we care? Not a question about logic, not a request for detail. Just a challenge. A test of frame. He paused. Not out of fear, but purpose. His gaze swept the table slowly, making eye contact just long enough to communicate presence without pleading. Because it matters, he said simply. No justification, no charts, no rehearsed speech. Just a statement that radiated certainty. A ripple passed across the table, almost imperceptible, but he felt it. The room shifted. Not everyone agreed, yet the gravity had subtly changed. The center of power, the silent pull of focus, now leaned slightly toward him. Another spoke, sharper this time. Explain. He shook his head. Not yet. The words were soft, almost casual, but they carried weight. By refusing the invitation to explain, he forced the room to adjust. Curiosity replaced judgment. Desire began to form, not for him, not yet, but for the story he would unfold. The third challenge was unspoken. The energy in the room flickered, a tension almost electric. He could sense the hunger for control, the ancient part of their minds seeking dominance. Some leaned forward, some reclined, testing him without a word. He did not flinch. He held the silence like a shield, letting the room reveal itself. Then, as if sensing his readiness, he began to speak. Not logically. Not with charts. Not with data. He told a story. A simple story, yet vivid, a scene of struggle, of triumph, of hidden opportunity. He painted it with words that conjured images, not just facts. He revealed glimpses of value without naming them outright, letting the mind fill the gaps. The effect was immediate. The room leaned in, subconsciously drawn by the tension, the mystery, the promise of what might come. They were not following facts, they were following the story, the frame, the invisible force he had created. Yet even as he spoke, he felt a shadow of doubt. One figure, the tallest, remained still, expression unreadable. Their eyes flicked once, sharp, assessing, almost predatory. This was not a failure yet. It was the final test, the arena's true challenge, resistance. Could he maintain his frame under scrutiny that sought to break him? He met the gaze steadily, refusing to concede. He allowed the story to continue, letting each word resonate in the room's collective tension. He watched as others adjusted subtly, leaning in, responding, pulled not by logic but by the gravity he had established. Minutes passed like hours. By the time he concluded, silence hung, heavy and expectant. No applause. No nods of understanding. Only attention, raw and waiting. Then, the tallest figure finally spoke. You have grasped the first lesson, they said, voice calm but sharp. But in the arena, first impressions are not enough. Will you survive when the stakes are higher, when the hunger is sharper, and the pressure nearly unbearable? The words lingered, echoing in his mind as he stepped down from the platform. He felt exhilaration and unease in equal measure. The test had not been about the idea, the charts, or the careful preparation he once trusted. It had been about his frame, his control, his ability to awaken desire without pleading. Outside, the sun had dipped low, painting the streets in molten gold. He walked without haste, feeling the city's hum, the pulse of unseen attention. He knew this arena would be the first of many, each larger, sharper, more dangerous. The lesson was clear: survive the room, master the frame, awaken desire, and then, perhaps, one could bend even the most formidable audience. But a subtle unease lingered. From a distance, a shadow moved, gliding with precision, observing him. It was not part of the arena he had just left, yet he knew instinctively that the game had eyes beyond the stage. The real challenge was approaching, and this time, it would test not just his mind, but the very center of gravity he had fought so hard to hold. Chapter 5, The Duel of Shadows. The streets were unusually quiet that evening, as if the city itself held its breath. He felt the lingering weight of the arena pressing against him, a subtle reminder that the lessons he had just learned were only the beginning. The shadow he had sensed earlier had not moved. It lingered at the edge of his vision, impossible to identify, yet impossible to ignore. He entered a small cafe, dimly lit, warm, and seemingly ordinary. A place where people came to drink coffee, read, or converse quietly. But he could feel the tension immediately. Someone was waiting. Not just waiting, but studying, measuring, calculating. He spotted them instantly, a figure sitting in a corner, half hidden by darkness, radiating calm power. The stranger did not rise. They did not smile. Their presence alone shifted the air, and he knew this was no casual meeting. This was a duel. A test of mastery. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the table, letting the room adjust to his presence. He did not speak first. He did not need to. The pull of his frame created its own gravity, drawing attention naturally. The stranger's eyes flicked up, acknowledging the challenge without words. You've been learning, the stranger said, voice smooth, precise, like polished stone. But knowledge is easy. Control is harder. Desire, rarer still. He nodded slightly, calm. I am learning what I must. The duel began without warning. Not with words, but with presence. Each subtle movement, each breath, each glance carried weight. Neither spoke, yet both were communicating, testing, probing for weakness. Around them, the cafe seemed to fade, as if the space had become an invisible arena where only the two of them existed. The stranger leaned back, almost lazily, yet the pull of authority radiated from them. They made no move to challenge overtly, but the energy was deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Every instinct he had, every technique he had practiced, was tested in an instant. Could he maintain his frame when the other's presence was absolute? He shifted slightly, small adjustments in posture, subtle changes in breathing. He allowed silence to stretch, letting curiosity form naturally. He did not explain. He did not plead. He revealed just enough to suggest command, leaving space for the mind of the other to follow. Minutes passed like a heartbeat. The stranger's eyes narrowed, and then, a slight smile appeared. Not of victory, but of recognition. They understood the dance. They had felt the pull of his gravity, the structure of his frame. And they were responding in kind, testing the edges of his control. You've held the arena, the stranger said finally. But the arena is small. Out there, the rules are not fixed. Others will try to collapse your frame, to draw you into chaos. You must learn to survive that, or all else fails. He considered the words carefully. Survival was only the first step. Desire, influence, and control must be maintained even when chaos arrived. The stranger leaned forward slightly, and he felt a sudden shift, the tiniest pull of tension, designed to unsettle. He did not flinch. He allowed curiosity to bloom instead of fear. The stranger spoke again, almost as an afterthought. Remember, every mind is a hall of mirrors. Some reflections deceive. Some intentions hide behind calm faces. If you misread even one, the consequences are immediate. He felt the truth of it. Influence was fragile. Even mastery could be undone by a single misstep. He had survived the first real arena, but now he understood that each encounter would grow sharper, each opponent more subtle, each test more dangerous. The cafe slowly returned to normal. Patrons went about their business, unaware of the silent battle that had unfolded. Yet he knew the duel had ended only in part. Lessons had been exchanged, frames had collided, but the real game awaited. Out there, beyond walls and mirrors, lay the rooms that demanded perfection. As he stepped into the night, the stranger's final words echoed, control is not enough. You must also create desire, or all else is wasted. He walked with a new understanding, the cool night air brushing his face. Shadows stretched long, as if the city itself was testing him, watching for cracks in his frame. He knew that the next stage would not be a simple pitch, a single test, or even a single room. It would be a series of arenas, each layered with expectation, curiosity, and silent hunger. And in the distance, at the edge of the street, he sensed another figure watching. Not overtly hostile, not immediately visible, yet present. Someone who would challenge him differently, not with force, but with subtlety. Someone who could bend rooms as easily as he could. The duel had ended, but the game was far from over. And this time, the stakes were not just attention or approval, they were survival, mastery, and the unspoken question of who would command the invisible currents of influence in a world that tested the mind as fiercely as the body. Chapter 6, The Convergence Room. The building rose like a silent fortress, dark glass reflecting the restless sky. He felt the weight of it before he reached the doors, the invisible pull of hundreds of eyes, waiting, judging, measuring. Today, unlike the quiet duels before, he would face multiple forces at once. A room filled with hunger, ambition, and unspoken agendas. A room where one misstep could shatter everything. Inside, the space was vast, almost cathedral-like. Light spilled from hidden sources, illuminating polished surfaces that reflected not only bodies but intent. At the far end, a long table stretched, seating a dozen figures, each radiating calm, controlled authority. Some leaned forward, probing, others reclined, indifferent but dangerous. Every gesture, every glance, carried a silent challenge. He stepped forward slowly. His own presence rippled through the room, subtle but undeniable. He did not speak yet. He did not need to. The invisible center of gravity, the room's attention, shifted, settling like water around a stone. The first move came almost immediately. A figure at the head of the table, eyes sharp, voice quiet but commanding, said, "Convince us." Not explain. Not prove. Convince. The word hung in the air like a blade. The other's eyes followed his every motion, each pair a test. Some radiated doubt, others curiosity. All tested his ability to maintain the frame under combined pressure. He paused. Not out of fear, but strategy. He allowed the silence to stretch, letting their anticipation build. Desire, he remembered, must be awakened, not demanded. The room needed to lean toward him, not be dragged. Then he spoke, slow and deliberate. Not a flood of logic, not a cascade of facts, but a story. He painted scenes of possibility, of hidden opportunity, of the potential unlocked by their collective vision. Each phrase was a brushstroke, each pause a pull on the room's attention. He revealed, hinted, suggested, but never over-explained. Subtle shifts occurred. One of the figures leaned forward slightly, curiosity stirring. Another checked a glowing device on the table, recording, but even that act was a response to his presence. The room, tense and watchful, began to bend, adjusting to the frame he held, but the challenge intensified. A figure at the far side interrupted, voice calm but edged with authority. What if your vision fails? A trap. A test. Not of logic, but of control. He did not rush to justify. He did not falter. He simply allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of the question linger, letting the room imagine failure and the consequences themselves. Then he responded, not with defense, but with clarity and certainty. The effect was immediate. Eyes shifted. Tension subtly shifted in his favor. The room began to lean, not outward, but inward, drawn toward the gravity of his presence. He realized that influence was a dance, not a battle. One could not push, one must pull. And the more the room tested him, the stronger his frame became. Minutes stretched. The dozen figures each presented a challenge, curiosity, doubt, subtle distraction, but he maintained composure, creating a rhythm, a structure that the room unconsciously followed. He revealed value without pleading. He stirred desire without demanding it. He controlled attention, but let it flow naturally toward him. Then, a sudden shift. One of the figures, previously silent, slammed a hand lightly on the table. The sound echoed sharply, breaking the rhythm. Eyes flicked toward him. Tension spiked. This was the final test, a sudden, unpredictable move meant to collapse his frame. He did not flinch. He held the silence, allowed curiosity to rise, and then leaned slightly forward, gaze steady, voice calm but resonant. The room responded. The tension softened. Desire and attention bent toward him once more, drawn by the invisible gravity he had created. When the meeting ended, the figures did not rise immediately. Some nodded slightly, some merely observed. The pull of his frame lingered, like a shadow etched into the space. He had survived, but he knew this was only a partial victory. Real mastery would require not only control, but anticipation of chaos, and the ability to bend multiple currents of desire simultaneously. As he left the room, the city outside seemed sharper, more alive. He felt the presence of unseen observers, shadows that had followed him into this convergence. They were waiting, studying, learning. Some would challenge him soon. Some would wait to see if his influence held, and in the corner of his vision, he glimpsed a figure standing in the distance, barely visible in the dim light, but radiating certainty. Someone who understood the rules as deeply as he did, and whose appearance promised that the real challenge, the ultimate test of frame, desire, and control, was fast approaching. Chapter 7, The Rival's Shadow. The city's night had a quiet pulse, like a heart beating just beneath the surface of streets and buildings. He could feel it, and he could feel the presence that had followed him since the convergence room. Not a simple observer, but a rival, someone who understood the invisible game, who could bend attention and desire as deftly as he could. The message arrived quietly, projected in a soft glow on his apartment wall. Tonight. The theater awaits. Do you have the courage to step inside? The theater was old, crumbling on the outside but alive within, as if magic lingered in its walls. Velvet curtains draped the entrance, thick enough to swallow the outside world. Inside, the space was enormous. Rows of empty chairs faced a wide stage, yet he sensed immediately that the audience was not ordinary. Invisible currents of expectation and judgment filled the room like wind in a canyon. At center stage stood a figure, waiting. Calm, unassuming at first glance, yet the air around them vibrated with authority. He recognized the energy immediately. This was the rival he had felt, the one who could match his frame, twist it, test it, perhaps even break it. The rival spoke first, voice soft but compelling. I've been watching you. You control rooms, bend attention, awaken desire, but can you survive when someone else's gravity competes with yours? He nodded slightly, understanding the challenge. This was not about ideas. Not about charts, facts, or careful explanation. This was a battle of frames, a collision of influence, a duel of the invisible currents that pulled the minds of others. The stage seemed to shrink, the light dimmed slightly, and the tension tightened like a wire pulled taut. Each of them began slowly, subtly. Every gesture, every breath, every glance was a move in the unseen game. The theater itself seemed to respond, shadows shifting, whispers of energy curling through the air. He started with presence. Not words, not explanation, but gravity. He allowed curiosity to form, letting the mind of the room, and his rival, lean toward him. The rival countered in silence, projecting subtle confidence, small hints of story and suggestion that forced him to adjust, to maintain his own center of gravity without yielding. Minutes passed. The duel unfolded like a slow storm. Words were sparse, almost unnecessary. Their frames collided, twisted, and bent, creating tension that was almost physical. Each had to anticipate the other, reveal enough to pull attention, but never so much as to give control away. At one point, the rival's eyes flicked toward a corner of the stage, and a sudden pulse of tension radiated from that direction. It was a test, an attempt to draw him into distraction. He did not falter. Instead, he let the curiosity form, bending the invisible pull back toward himself, turning the rival's move into fuel for his own presence. Then came the subtle trap. A whispered question, almost inaudible, designed to collapse his frame. He felt the pull, the momentary crack of instinct urging him to explain, to justify, to prove himself. But he did not. He let the silence stretch, allowed the desire to follow him to grow, and responded instead with a single, deliberate phrase, a story fragment that hinted at value without demanding agreement. The rival paused, acknowledging the skill. The tension shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible nod of recognition. The room, alive with invisible forces, breathed with their duel. Influence and attention bent between them like a river splitting and merging, each testing the limits of the other's mastery. Finally, the rival spoke, voice calm, almost amused. You've grown stronger. But strength alone is not enough. One day, someone will match your frame and your timing, and you will be forced to bend or break. Are you ready for that? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he observed, felt, and absorbed the lesson. The duel was not over, it would never be over. Influence was infinite, and mastery required constant adjustment, constant awareness, constant anticipation. The rival's shadow would follow him into every room, every meeting, every encounter, shaping the challenges ahead. The duel ended without applause, without resolution. The theater returned to silence, but the echoes of tension remained, vibrating in the air and in his mind. He understood now, true mastery would not be a single victory, a single pitch, or a single arena. It would be the ongoing ability to maintain frame, command attention, and awaken desire, even when another force of equal skill opposed him. As he left the theater, the streets seemed to hum with life. Shadows stretched and flickered, whispers of unseen observers brushing against his awareness. The rival's presence lingered in his mind, a constant reminder that the next challenge would demand more than skill, it would demand ingenuity, courage, and the ability to bend not just rooms, but the very currents of desire themselves. And somewhere, in the distance, another light glimmered, an unspoken challenge waiting for him, more dangerous, more subtle, and far more powerful than anything he had faced before. Chapter 8, The Labyrinth of Persuasion. The city felt different that morning, as if it had been reshaped overnight by invisible hands. The streets twisted more sharply, the shadows lengthened in unusual ways, and the air carried a faint electric charge. He could feel the pulse of attention everywhere, the subtle shifts of influence threading through the crowd. Today, he was not walking into a single room. He was walking into a labyrinth. The building appeared ordinary at first, brick, glass, doors that swung easily. But the moment he stepped inside, he sensed its true nature. The interior shifted subtly, corridors bending, angles seeming to change just out of sight. Light flickered in patterns that drew the eye towards some areas while concealing others. He understood instantly, this was a place designed to test perception, patience, and control. Every step would be observed, every hesitation measured. At the center of the labyrinth awaited a room he had been told would contain the most formidable audience yet. Not a single table, not a single stage, but a gathering of forces, each expert in their own form of influence, each ready to bend or break him if given a chance. A dozen, then 24, all watching, all silent. Their collective attention was like gravity, heavy and inescapable. He paused at the threshold, feeling the pull of dozens of unseen currents. His instincts whispered panic, charts, graphs, arguments, but he had learned better. He exhaled slowly, centering himself, imagining the invisible frames of the room, preparing to anchor them without demanding their attention. The door opened. The labyrinth seemed to sigh, as if acknowledging his arrival. Inside, the space was vast and oddly distorted, the ceiling high and disappearing into shadows. Faces appeared from corners and behind screens, all radiating authority. Some leaned forward, curiosity flickering in their eyes, others reclined, calm, unflinching, testing him without words. The room was alive, a predator with many heads, and all of them were watching. The first challenge came immediately. One voice, sharp and precise, asked, "Why should we listen to you?" Not a request for proof, but a test of frame. He allowed a pause, letting the silence stretch until the room leaned in almost involuntarily. Then he spoke, not with explanation, but with suggestion. He painted a brief image of possibility, a story fragment that hinted at value without fully revealing it. Desire began to stir. Curiosity followed. The room adjusted. Another voice, colder this time, interrupted, "And what if it fails?" He did not answer with logic. He allowed the tension to hang, creating space for imagination. In that silence, the room began to ask itself questions, to fill the gaps with interest and engagement rather than doubt. He had learned that people do not resist stories, they resist being told what to believe. The labyrinth itself seemed to respond. Shadows shifted, reflecting movement he had not seen directly. Figures appeared, disappeared, sometimes overlapping, forcing him to maintain attention on multiple points simultaneously. Each gesture, each subtle change of tone, each carefully measured pause became a tool in a complex web of influence. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched, compressed, folded over themselves. The room tested him with small traps, interruptions, faint gestures of disagreement, subtle challenges, but he maintained his frame, bending attention without breaking it, awakening desire without overreaching. Finally, a voice rose above the others, almost melodic in its authority. "You control presence, but can you control the pull of our collective minds?" He understood the true test. Influence was no longer linear. It was a network, a web of desire and attention, each thread tugging at him, each subtle movement a potential collapse of his frame. He moved through it like a dancer, guiding attention, sustaining curiosity, and bending tension toward inevitability. By the end, the room was still. Not all were convinced, but all were attentive. Desire had been planted, curiosity stirred, attention aligned with his gravity. He had not overpowered the labyrinth, nor had he explained or argued. He had created a structure that the room naturally followed. As he left, the corridors seemed to stretch and fold behind him, returning to their ordinary shape. Yet he felt the lesson lingering in his chest. Influence was not about force, but structure, not about proof, but perception, not about explanation, but the creation of desire. Outside, the city hummed in quiet challenge. Shadows flickered at the edges of streets, observers moving silently, testing the strength of the frame he carried. And in the distance, a faint glow pulsed on a building he had not noticed before, a silent signal that the next stage of the game was approaching. One that would not only test attention and desire, but the ability to bend reality itself in the minds of others. Chapter 9, The Chamber of Hidden Currents. The building loomed like a sentinel at the edge of the city, black glass reflecting a restless sky. He felt the pull of the place before he even stepped inside, a quiet gravity, heavy and deliberate, as if the walls themselves measured intention. Today was different. Today, the arena was not a single opponent, a single room, or a single challenge. Today, he would confront multiple forces, each vying to dominate, each testing the limits of attention, control, and desire. Inside, the chamber was immense, but the scale was deceptive. Light came from hidden sources, casting shifting patterns across polished floors. Shadows curled and bent along walls, creating subtle illusions, making movement unpredictable. From the moment he entered, he could feel every pair of eyes, every unconscious judgment, every silent tug on his frame. The room itself was alive. At the center, a long table stretched, its surface black and reflective. Around it, 12 figures sat, each radiating authority and calm menace. Some leaned forward, curiosity flickering in their eyes, others reclined, confident, unshakable. He sensed immediately that each was testing him, individually and collectively, weaving currents of influence that threatened to pull him off balance. He stepped forward, letting the gravity of his own frame ripple outward. Not a word yet. Not an explanation. Just presence. The room responded subtly, like water bending around a stone. Desire and curiosity began to form, drawn to the center of his energy, but the currents were complicated. Several of the figures were actively testing him, creating small traps, interruptions, subtle gestures, faint tones meant to provoke uncertainty. The first voice cut through the tension, calm but sharp. "Why should we follow your lead?" He paused. Not because he lacked an answer, but because the room required structure, not urgency. A silence stretched, heavy, compelling attention to align naturally. Then he spoke, not with logic, not with facts, but with story. A fragment, vivid and imaginative, hinting at opportunity and success without naming it outright. Curiosity deepened. Desire began to coil like a spring in the room. Another challenge appeared almost immediately. A figure leaned back, voice smooth, almost casual, and if it fails? He did not defend. He did not justify. Instead, he allowed the tension to linger, letting the room imagine consequences and possibilities themselves. Influence, he realized, was strongest when it was co-created, not forced. Desire must emerge, not be demanded. Then the chamber tested him in a new way. Two figures acted simultaneously, subtle gestures and comments designed to pull him in opposite directions. Attention split, currents collided, and instinct urged him to respond, to explain, to justify. He did not. He anchored himself. He maintained his frame. He allowed curiosity and desire to flow along the paths he controlled, bending the invisible forces toward him rather than resisting blindly. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The 12 forces around the table presented a constant barrage of subtle challenges, eye movements, tone shifts, pauses, faint smiles, hidden impatience. Every instinct he had relied on in the past whispered panic, explain more, prove yourself, argue harder. But he had learned better. Calm, controlled, deliberate. Presence over persuasion. Structure over chaos. Finally, the head of the table, a tall figure with eyes that seemed to pierce the air itself, spoke, "You control presence, yet the currents are many. Can you bend all of them without losing yourself?" He understood the weight of the question. Influence was no longer linear. It was a network, a web of tension, desire, and attention, constantly shifting. One misstep could collapse his frame entirely. But he had trained for this. He allowed the currents to flow through him, guided them subtly, amplified curiosity, and awakened desire, all while maintaining the center of gravity in his favor. By the time the chamber fell silent, all 12 figures had leaned in slightly. Desire had been stoked. Attention had been drawn. Curiosity was now fully engaged. He had not overpowered the room with argument, logic, or explanation. He had shaped the invisible forces to his will, yet he knew this victory was partial. Influence was infinite, and mastery required constant adaptation. The chamber had tested him, but many rooms remained. Many forces waited in shadow, unseen but present, ready to exploit the smallest crack in his frame. As he stepped out into the night, the city seemed alive in a new way, shadows stretching long, light flickering oddly, as if testing his attention. And at the edge of his vision, he sensed another presence, unseen, deliberate, patient. Someone, or something, that would challenge not just his frame, but his very understanding of control and desire in ways he could not yet imagine. The game was far from over, and the next chamber promised a trial that could either elevate him to mastery or shatter everything he had built. Chapter 10, The Chamber of Illusions. The building rose silently from the mist, its dark walls reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. He had walked past it countless times without noticing, but tonight, it felt alive, almost breathing. Inside, he sensed immediately that logic would not serve him. Facts, charts, and explanations were meaningless here. This chamber was a place of perception, a room where reality bent to desire, attention, and subtle influence. The door opened without sound. He stepped inside and the air shifted. The room was vast, yet the walls seemed to move, expanding and contracting with his gaze. Shadows stretched unnaturally, flickering in ways that drew attention to some corners while hiding others. Light shifted with no visible source, highlighting certain figures while leaving others in darkness. The chamber itself was a participant, a living, breathing observer of all that occurred within it. The center, a circle of people awaited. Some sat in chairs that seemed ordinary, others reclined on platforms that disappeared into shadows. Their eyes were calm but hungry, radiating attention like a magnet, pulling and probing for weakness. He could feel the invisible currents twisting around him, subtle tests of frame, control, and presence. The first challenge was immediate. A figure rose and spoke, voice melodic and compelling. "How do we know what you show us is true?" He did not answer directly. He allowed the silence to stretch, letting the question hang like a weight in the room. Desire and curiosity began to stir naturally. The room wanted to know, to follow, to be drawn. Then he revealed a story, not logic, not proof, but a vivid scene of opportunity and transformation. The figures leaned in, captivated, pulled by the gravity of his frame rather than the content of his words. Another challenge arose. Shadows shifted, creating fleeting illusions. Figures appeared where none existed, movements suggested outcomes that might never come. One voice, smooth and edged with authority, asked, "And if it is all an illusion?" He smiled faintly. Then it is an illusion that guides the mind toward what it seeks, he replied. The words were simple, but the delivery controlled attention, bending curiosity and tension into alignment with his presence. The room responded immediately. Desire deepened, not for the idea, but for the journey, the narrative, the invisible pull that made them lean in without understanding why. The chamber tested him further. Figures acted in subtle concert, creating layers of distraction, false signals, and competing attention. Shadows flickered, some mimicking him, some hiding in corners, and he had to maintain not only his frame but his perception, discerning reality from manipulation without revealing doubt. Minutes passed like hours. The room pushed, pulled, twisted, yet he remained steady. He allowed curiosity and desire to rise naturally, guiding the currents of attention without forcing them. Influence here was not about proving strength, it was about shaping perception, controlling tension, and awakening want without coercion. Finally, the tallest figure in the circle rose, their presence overwhelming yet calm. You bend attention, you shape desire, yet this chamber will test your mind itself. Can you maintain your frame when perception is not stable, when reality itself shifts beneath your feet? He understood instantly, this was the ultimate test. Influence was no longer linear. The currents were complex, unpredictable, and partially false. One misstep could collapse his control entirely. But he had trained for this. He allowed himself to flow with the illusions, bending the room's perception toward clarity without needing to expose himself to distraction. When he left the chamber, the world outside felt sharper, brighter, and heavier with unspoken expectation. Shadows seemed to linger, watching, analyzing, waiting. He had survived the illusions, but he knew the lesson would remain. Perception is malleable, attention is currency, and desire must be awakened, not commanded. And far ahead, in the darkened streets, he sensed a figure observing him from the edge of shadow, a silent reminder that the true trial, the one that could finally crown him or break him, was drawing near, waiting in a room where all the lessons, all the games, and all the invisible currents would collide at once. Chapter 11, The Final Arena. The building loomed like a monolith at the edge of the city, black and reflective, swallowing the faint glow of streetlights. He could feel its presence before he stepped inside, a gravity unlike anything he had experienced before, pulling at attention, bending perception, and warning him that this room would demand everything he had learned. The doors opened silently, revealing a space vast and impossibly high-ceilinged. Light came from no visible source, shifting in subtle patterns that highlighted certain figures while leaving others in shadow. The room itself seemed alive, breathing with tension. Every corner, every surface, seemed to watch him, to test him. This was no ordinary meeting. This was the ultimate arena. At the center, a long table stretched like a dark river, surrounded by dozens of people. Some leaned forward, eyes sharp with curiosity and subtle challenge, others reclined, radiating calm control, exuding influence without words. Shadows flickered across the walls, creating illusions that twisted perception. He sensed multiple forces at work, rivals, observers, hidden agendas, all converging in a single place. He stepped forward, letting his presence ripple outward. Not a word yet. Not a chart, not a pitch. The invisible currents of attention, desire, and judgment bent toward him naturally, sensing a force capable of commanding the room. The first challenge came immediately. A figure at the head of the table spoke, voice calm but edged with authority. Why should we follow you? He allowed silence to stretch, feeling the room lean in, waiting, curious. Then he spoke, not with logic or explanation, but with story. A vivid fragment, suggesting opportunity, triumph, and hidden value. Eyes followed him instinctively. Desire began to stir. The currents shifted subtly, bending in response to his gravity. The room escalated the test. Two figures acted simultaneously, probing from opposite sides. Shadows flickered, some moving to distract, others creating faint illusions of rival presence. He maintained his frame, guiding attention, bending tension, awakening curiosity. He did not defend. He did not plead. He revealed selectively, letting desire form naturally in the minds of those present. Then came a sudden trap, a voice sharp and deliberate cut through the tension, designed to break his rhythm. The invisible currents twisted, pulling at his instincts, trying to collapse his frame. He did not flinch. He allowed the pause to stretch, letting imagination and tension do the work for him. Desire and attention bent back toward him, drawn by gravity rather than argument. Minutes passed like hours. Every gesture, every pause, every slight movement became a weapon in the invisible duel. He sensed the minds around him, rival currents testing his limits, probing for cracks, attempting to collapse his center. He held steady, bending attention, awakening curiosity, controlling desire, navigating multiple competing forces at once. Finally, the tallest figure rose, voice calm but resonant. You control presence, attention, and desire. But can you maintain it when everything you have learned is tested simultaneously, when every mind in this room challenges your frame at once? He understood. This was the ultimate synthesis of all lessons: the arena, the hall of mirrors, the rival, the labyrinth, the illusions. Every skill, every instinct, every subtle technique was needed to survive this moment. He let the currents converge, bending attention without force, guiding desire without demand, controlling tension without breaking. The room leaned in, collectively drawn by the structure he created. Desire coiled like a spring, curiosity sharpened, attention aligned. Every rival, every observer, every shadow felt the gravity of his frame. He had not overpowered, not explained, not pleaded. He had orchestrated the invisible forces to follow him. Naturally, inevitably, the chamber fell silent. Not a nod, not applause, but a quiet acknowledgement, heavy with understanding. He had not only survived, the room, the rivals, the observers, and the shifting currents had yielded to his presence, curiosity, and authority. As he stepped outside, the night seemed alive in a new way. Shadows stretched, street lights flickered, and the city hummed with unspoken energy. He had passed the ultimate test of influence, frame, and desire, but he knew instinctively that the world beyond would always hold more challenges, more currents, more rooms to bend and master. And somewhere in the distance, hidden in the folds of light and shadow, he sensed yet another presence, waiting. Not hostile, not urgent, but patient, deliberate, a reminder that mastery was never final, only temporary, and that the game, like the city, like attention, like desire itself, never ended. Chapter 12, The Citadel of Influence. The path to the citadel was shrouded in mist, twisting between jagged cliffs and forests that whispered in the night. The city's pulse faded behind him, replaced by the hum of something ancient, almost alive. He knew this was the ultimate destination, the place where all lessons, all trials, and all invisible currents would converge. A place that existed both in the world and in the mind, where mastery was tested in its purest form. The gates opened before him without hinges or sound, revealing a courtyard bathed in soft, shifting light. Shadows moved with deliberate grace, forming figures that watched silently, neither hostile nor welcoming. Their eyes carried the weight of experience, of authority, of forces unseen and yet deeply felt. This was not just a test of presence, it was a test of being itself. Inside, the citadel unfolded in impossible geometry. Corridors bent impossibly, staircases twisted back upon themselves, and chambers appeared to float, anchored only by perception. Light and shadow played tricks on the mind, and he realized immediately that the true challenge was not merely surviving the space, but commanding it, to bend attention, desire, and curiosity in a place that sought to confound them. At the heart of the citadel, a hall stretched wider than any room he had entered. It was filled with observers, rivals, and enigmatic figures, each radiating power and mastery. The air vibrated with expectation. He could feel every mind weighing him, every silent question probing for weakness. Influence here was absolute, and mistakes would be remembered forever. He stepped forward calmly, allowing his presence to ripple outward. Not a word, not a chart, not a plea, just gravity. Attention bent naturally toward him. Desire stirred. Curiosity awakened. He understood instinctively that mastery was no longer about controlling others through argument, facts, or explanation. It was about creating a frame so strong, so magnetic, that the world aligned with it willingly. The first figure approached, a tall, commanding presence whose eyes seemed to see through the layers of thought itself. "You have survived the arenas, the illusions, the labyrinths," they said. "But here, every thought, every intention, every hidden desire is laid bare. Can you hold your frame when the very essence of influence is in question?" He did not answer. He let the silence stretch, letting the question itself awaken curiosity. Then, slowly, deliberately, he moved through the hall. Each step was a signal, each gesture a subtle command of attention. Desire followed him naturally, bending toward the gravity of his frame without coercion. Other figures tested him in turn, subtly, shifting shadows, fleeting questions, sudden challenges meant to fracture perception. He remained steady. He allowed tension to rise, desire to coil, and attention to flow along invisible currents that he alone controlled. No argument, no proof, no explanation, just mastery of presence, structure, and subtle influence. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed in a suspended rhythm. The citadel itself seemed to lean toward him, recognizing the command of his frame. desire and curiosity intertwined in the minds of those present, bending not by force, but by inevitability. He had learned to guide perception, control attention, and awaken desire simultaneously, harmonizing them into a structure that even this living, breathing space could not resist. Finally, the central figure spoke again, voice calm, resonant, almost melodic. You have reached the apex. Influence, attention, desire, they bend to your command. Yet remember, mastery is not a crown. It is a responsibility. Every room, every mind, every unseen current is now part of the world you shape. Will you use it wisely? He nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. The citadel did not demand obedience, it offered understanding. Influence was a living force, flowing through rooms, people, and perception itself. Mastery was not about dominance, it was about alignment, about creating a frame so strong and magnetic that the world followed naturally, willingly, and inevitably. As he stepped out of the citadel into the first rays of dawn, the mist began to lift. The world seemed sharper, alive with possibility. Shadows stretched, attention pulsed, desire lingered like a subtle fragrance in the air. He had learned the final lesson: influence is not about persuasion or logic. It is about control of the frame, command of attention, and awakening desire, an invisible art that shapes every room, every interaction, every moment. And as he walked forward, he felt the pull of countless unseen currents, subtle and infinite. The game did not end. Mastery was a path, not a destination. And somewhere, beyond every shadow, past every gaze, the next arena awaited, ready to test, challenge, and push him even further into the mastery of influence itself. If you enjoyed this retelling of Pitch Anything, tell me in the comments, what other audiobook would you like to see retold next on Momentum Mind? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a mind-shifting story.